Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us here today for another fascinating, if not intriguing, webinar program. My name is Michael Steinberger. I am founder and CEO of Jewish Heritage Alliance, a nonprofit platform dedicated to research, preserve, and most importantly, to promote the legacy of SEFARAD, referring to the Jews that lived and were expelled from the Iberian Peninsula, nowadays Spain and Portugal. In order to broaden our scope and expand our reach, we developed a strategic alliance and partners consisting of global organizations, institutions, and individuals covering the private and public sectors that together create a voice of the collective, thereby amplifying our message. At this time, I would like to acknowledge and thank our co-sponsors for helping make today's presentation possible. I would like to thank the Leonard Miller Center for Contemporary Judaic Studies and the George Filmnigris Program in Judaic Studies of the University of Miami. I also would like to thank Congregation Mikveh Israel by way of the late scholar Herman Prince Salomon. I would also like to thank and acknowledge our co-hosting partners for helping promote today's event. And they are the Greater Miami Jewish Federation, the Center for Advancement of Jewish Education, also in Miami, also known as CAGE, the Honor Museum of the Jewish People, the Society for Cryptic Judaic Studies, the European Jewish Community Center, the Women's International Zionist Organization of Florida, also referred to as WITZO, and last but certainly not least, our friends at Reconnectar. Thank you one and all. Please feel free to contact us should you or your organization wish to sponsor any of our future events. Before we get started, I would like to share with you, our audience, that the topic of this series is not a very easy or comfortable subject to tackle. The history of slavery, and especially the involvement of Jews and conversos, conversos being Jews who are forced to convert to Christianity, also referred to as new Christians, is somewhat sensitive. However, as ominous as this may sound, and as you will learn in today's event, slavery had a different meaning, a whole different connotation throughout history. It is also important to mention and to note that Jews helped and participated to fight and end slavery, including here in the United States of America. This is certainly a complex discussion fraught with misunderstandings, and today's event and the entire three-part series were intended to bring clarity to this topic. We ask you, our audience, to insert your questions exclusively in the Q&A section of this webinar, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. At this time, I would like to introduce today's moderator, my friend and colleague, Dr. Isaac Amon, the Director of Academic Research at Jewish Heritage Alliance. Dr. Amon is an attorney and counselor at law. He was a legal fellow at the International Criminal Tribunal at the former Yugoslavia in The Hague, legislative director at the Missouri Department of Correction, and an ISIS war crimes investigator. He is an adjunct professor at Washington University School of Law in St. Louis, Missouri. And this past summer, he was a scholar in residence at Oxford University through the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy. A proud grandson of Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jewish immigrants, he often speaks on the law, international criminal justice, and the Jewish memory, including anti-Semitism, the Inquisition, and the Holocaust. So at this point, I turn it over to my friend Isaac. Take it away, Isaac.
Thank you, Michael. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you may be. And welcome to today's webinar, part 2 of a 3-part series on slavery, legacy, and modern reflections. And as a reminder, the last webinar in this series, part 3, from the Declaration of Independence to the Civil War, will be on Sunday, May 11th, 2 weeks from today, which will examine slavery and the American Jewish experience amidst the backdrop of the 250th anniversary of the beginning of the American Revolution and the 160th anniversary of the end of the Civil War. Today, in part 2 of this series, From Expulsion to the American Revolution, we continue a story that we began 3 weeks ago in part 1. And this discussion, as Michael mentioned, is as challenging as it is necessary, a dialogue that sits at the crossroads of history, truth, and identity. We are here to examine the extraordinary history in part 2 of Portuguese conversos, Jews forcibly converted to Catholicism and their descendants, and their connection, real or perceived, to the transatlantic slave trade. For many, this subject is emotionally charged, historically dense, and ethically complex. It demands that we speak with honesty and care. And so let us begin with this truth. Jews and conversos were not drivers of the transatlantic slave trade. They were not the architects of it or the financiers behind it. The institution of slavery, as it developed across the Atlantic world, was built and sustained by empires, monarchies, and mercantile interests, primarily Christian European powers, especially Spain, Portugal, Britain, and the Netherlands. Yet as we dig deeper into this history, we find that a small number of conversos found themselves entangled in colonial trading networks, some of which included the buying and selling of slaves. They were navigating Christian societies that had robbed them of their identities, persecuted their ancestors, and branded their very existence with suspicion. Some assimilated, some sought safety and economic mobility, and a few, like their Christian neighbors, became part of the colonial slave economy. It is historically and morally wrong to inflate the limited role of some conversos into a false narrative of Jewish responsibility for slavery. And indeed, this involvement, limited, exceptional, and often marginal, has frequently been exaggerated, misrepresented, or weaponized, especially in virulently anti-Semitic narratives that distort the past for political or ideological purposes or agendas. Nonetheless, it is also incorrect to dismiss the lives and choices of those Jews and conversos who did participate in this system of bondage, or simply not talk about this subject, however uncomfortable it is. And we lastly must remember that amidst this milieu, especially for today's presentation, forever lurking in the shadow was the Inquisition, which haunted conversos in Spain, Portugal, and its colonies for over 300 years. This tribunal was not merely a tool of extraordinary persecution, it was a system of total erasure that destroyed entire families and communities, silenced identities, and created generations of people who had to survive by hiding who they were or wished to be. And this legacy endures today. Ultimately, history demands honesty, and so today's talk and this whole series is not about blame, but about complexity and acknowledging the full picture, not to condemn or to excuse, but to educate and illuminate, and to separate fact from fiction. I now have the honor of introducing today's presenter, a friend, colleague, an expert in this topic, Hacham or Rabbi Dr. Yehonatan Elazar de Mota, who was born in Miami. He comes from a long line of Sephardi families from Spain, Portugal, and North Africa, which established themselves in the Caribbean before migrating to the United States of America. He holds an MA in anthropology and religious studies from Florida International University and a PhD in international law from the University of Amsterdam. And currently, he is a distinguished research fellow at the Law and Religion Department at Emory University. Yehonatan, I turn it over to you.
I'd like to give thanks to Michael and also Isaac for their presentations. And I will begin now speaking about part 2 of what we began last time. Last time we talked about Canaanite slavery in the Bible and also in the Talmudic literature. We explored also how rabbis conceived of this idea within SEFARAD in that context. Today, what we're going to look at is how all of this law played out in the Spanish and Portuguese Jewish diaspora, namely within the context of the transatlantic slave trade. So the expulsion happened from Spain, or Sefarad, in 1492. One-third of the Jews went next door to Portugal. Another third went to the lands of the Ottoman Empire and Italy. And another third converted, became Catholic Christians. Then, 5 years later, 1497, the Jews who were in Portugal, the Spanish Jews who moved there, plus the indigenous Portuguese Jews who had been there before, they were forcibly converted during Easter week, 1497. And this begins what we know as the Portuguese Jewish diaspora. Already at the end of the 16th century, Spain and Portugal annexed under one crown, and those crypto Jews, or Anusim, if you will, they moved from Portugal into the Spanish lands, and from Spain, they were able to escape into France, and from France, they moved on to Belgium, present-day Antwerp city, and from there, they went to Hamburg, Germany, and also moved along to the Netherlands into the 17th century. The story that I'm going to tell you today tells us about the Judeo-Portuguese diaspora and their involvement with slavery and slave trade. So this map here shows us various places where Spanish, Portuguese, Jewish communities were established. We can see in Africa, there are various places here. Also in the lands of the Ottoman Empire. In Italy, we have in Northern Europe, Christian lands. And when we go westward to the islands, we have here Hispaniola, Cuba, Puerto Rico, also the Western Caribbean, which includes Panama, Venezuela, Colombia, and various places in South America, including Brazil and Suriname, Guyana. All these places, Portuguese Jews went to these places, not as open Jews, mostly as conversos, as they're known, or as new Christians. Only in those places where the Spanish and Portuguese Inquisitions did not have jurisdiction were they able to settle and practice the Torah as Jews openly. One of the most important aspects of history that is unknown or left out from many history books is the notion or the idea of the nação. Nação referring to the Portuguese nation of Hebrews. This is how they're recognized in the inquisitorial archives as a gente da nação, the people of the nation, of the Hebrew nation among the Portuguese. So we have nação communities in West Africa, namely in a region called Senegambia. Senegambia includes Mauritania, Mali, Gambia, Guinea-Bissau, Guinea or Guinea, and also Senegal. So we can see here a larger map of this region here of West Africa. Portuguese Jews started settling there from the 15th century, and they settled and established communities. I'm going to show you some very interesting facts about these communities. This is one of the important books that you can reference on what I'm going to tell you about the Jewish communities in West Africa and the making of the Atlantic world, the forgotten diaspora. This is quote, in the 16th and 17th century, many of the dark-skinned Euro-Africans, that means European and African mixture, they have an offspring, in the Upper Guinea, who were not subject to enslavement, were either called Portuguese or whites. During the same period, membership to the Nação was not determined by one's physical appearance, and the appellation of white was assigned to wealthy traders, regardless of their skin color. So basically what this is telling us is that being Portuguese was equated with being white, and being white was not necessarily a skin color, it was more of a social status. If you were part of the Nação community, no matter how dark skinned you were or light skinned, you will be considered to be Portuguese, and you'll be considered white by the locals in West Africa. We have, in the 17th century, two brothers, Diogo and Felipe Sousa, who were Nação merchants from Amsterdam and settled in Senegal. And they had connections with Portugal, with Holland, with England, and Milan in Italy. Atlantic slavery begins in the 16th century when Portuguese Anusim or conversos established trade networks in various islands Madeira, Azores, the Canary Islands. And in these places, they established trading posts and Jewish communities. And by Jewish communities, I mean they were secret communities. They didn't have open or public worship because these lands were under Portugal or Spain. So they were not able to do that. We have here in this map, you can see where Azores, the Azores Islands are, also Madeira Islands, and the Canary Islands as well. So these are close to West Africa, and this distance is what is going to facilitate the slave trade coming from sub-Saharan Africa, Mauritania specifically, all the way from Mauritania all the way down to Angola. And these slaves are being brought to these islands by Portuguese Jews. Hacientistas refers to those persons who had the contracts in Spain in order to be able to sell slaves in the New World, in the colonies. And if you were not an hacientista or hacientista, you didn't have these contracts, you cannot sell slaves. Spain would not allow it. And so one of the important facts about this is that Antonio Fernandez Elvas, in the 17th century, he was an hacientista, and he had contracts to sell slaves directly to the colonies between 1580, 1640. And he held these asientos, or these contracts, between 1614 and 1622. He was connected to every single or major slave trader in the Spanish and Portuguese Empire. And as clandestine Jews, Nassau merchants were able to circumvent the limpieza de sangre decree, which was purity of blood, stating that if you didn't have more than 3 generations of, you weren't able to prove 3 generations of old Christian blood, you were not able to enter the New World colonies. But these Jews managed to circumvent these laws by different ways. Tango mounds and lançados are very important because they are Euro-African Jews, meaning a Portuguese father and African mother, and lançados refers to those who launched or threw themselves on the slave ships and went across the Atlantic. And many of the lançados were Euro-African Jews, with a Portuguese Jewish father and an African mother who had converted to the Jewish tradition in the fashion that we explained in our last lecture on Canaanite slavery. Entanglement is another term which is also utilized in the literature in West Africa for these European African Jews. Now we go to the Kahal Kadosh Talmud Torah Etz Chaim, which is a very important community, which is, I will consider, the mastermind behind the material and the doctrinal contribution to the transatlantic slave trade. There's a document that I found in the archives of the community. It's written in the 17th century in French, and it's archived in Spanish as El Negocio de los Negros, the business of the blacks, literally, of the Negroes. This is what the contract looks like. It's very difficult to read, but I wanted you to see it. Beautiful handwriting in cursive. And as I said, it's written in French. So let's analyze this. This contract is written in French. It deals with investors from Amsterdam's Portuguese community so the Amsterdam's Portuguese Jewish community, and the Dutch West Indies Company, which is, we'll call it the WIC. And the communal archives have these papers in Spanish entitled El Negocio de los Negros. So this contract stipulates, one, that the Nação was exempted by the king from the prohibition of purchasing slaves, because not everyone could purchase slaves, but the Nação was exempted from this prohibition. The director of the WIC, the Dutch Indies Company, would pay Nassau investors with 110 piezas de India per year. This piezas de India refers to the highest quality of slaves, which are usually between the age of 20 and 35, because they are the strongest. The slaves came from Angola and from São Domingo, which is in Cape Verde. Now, this document also says that blacks coming from these places were exempted from all rights belonging to the WIC and the King of Holland. That means they have no human rights as we know them today. Also, the WIC provides passports for the slaves to be transported from Angola to São Domingos. And then from São Domingos and Cape Verde, they were then taken by these Portuguese Jewish slave traders to then be taken wherever they went to in the Atlantic or back to Europe. Then there's an interesting clause, force majeure clause, which means force majeure meaning an external, a major force or a great force. In law, this refers to when something is out of your hand. Sometimes there's a clause in the contract referring to the acts of God, something having to do with nature. So this clause stipulates that there should there be an accident with the choice slaves, the WIC will be responsible for supplying Nassau investors with slaves from the king's domain, wherever they may be. And what we learned from this contract is that after 1621, Portuguese Jews in Amsterdam, they were not so much involved directly in the slave trade, but they invested money in the slave trade. Those who were directly involved were those who were on the ground. And we're going to see a little bit about that in a bit. Now let's talk about the Chachamim, the rabbis, and some of their justifications for enslavement. We have two that I want to talk about today. Isaac Atias in his book, Tesoros de Preceptos, and Menashe ben Israel in Tesoros dos Dinim. This is Rabbi or Chacham Yitzhak Atias in his Tesoro de Preceptos, where he delineates the 613 precepts following the organization of the Rambam on the 613 precepts of the Torah. And this is positive precept number 235. And he says the following: when it comes to the enslavement of the Canaanite slave, it says that we serve in perpetuum the pagan slave. And then he says, this means that we cannot give freedom the way we give freedom to the Hebrews, to other Jews, but that they are freed from their slave masters if and only if the slave master mistreats that slave, or taking out causing injury to one of his eyes or teeth, or so on and so forth. He says we call him pagan not because of his nation, but because of his religion, because he doesn't want to become circumcised nor enter into the ritual. So this way he is considered to be a pagan. Otherwise he will be considered to be a servant, siervo. So we understood in Canaanite slavery in our last lecture that Canaanite slaves or non-Jewish slaves went through a ritual of circumcision for men and then a ritual bath at the moment of purchasing the slave. And then after 12 months of convincing the slave to become a Jew, then there was a second ritual bath, after which this slave became a full-fledged Jew and was freed and became a member of the Jewish nation. And so Rabbi Isaac Atiyah continues, and he says that men can govern themselves without servitude, without maid servants and servants. It is impossible because the congregation of Israel is so occupied with holy offices, holy services, that they are obligated to be at rest and to be free in order to serve God. And it is not calmly, or it's not correct for them to serve, to enslave, or to hire or employ their brothers or the co-religionists. So this is why servants are able to be utilized within the community who are not from the nation of Israel. This is one of the justifications. Now we move along to Chacham Menashe ben Israel, who's very famous in the historiography of this community, namely because he convinced the King Oliver Cromwell of England in the 17th century to permit the Jews to enter into England. After 500 years of expulsion, they were allowed to go back because of Menashe ben Israel. He convinced them theologically. And he wrote a halachic treatise, Jewish law, which has 5 books. It is practically a translation of Shulchan Aruch. And what he does here, he translates it into Portuguese, but he adds his nuances. He has many nuances which are dealing with the legal anthropology at the time. And because slavery and slave trade is prevalent at the time, in book 5, he talks about ownership and possession. And what he does here is very interesting because if you know a little bit about the Lex Aquila, which is a Greek law, there is a way of dividing or classifying different types of properties. So the Greek law classifies property as movable and immovable, rational, irrational. And what Menashe ben Israel does here, he uses the same exact classification. And he says that there are 2 types of properties, movable and immovable. And then from those that are, then he says those that are movable, they are rational and they are irrational. And among the class of the rational properties, which are movable, we have slaves, female and male slaves. And then among the irrational, we have animals, such as the birds and quadrupeds, beasts. I find this to be so interesting because he's putting slaves on the same category with animals. And at the time, there's a huge discussion in philosophy, in philosophy of law at the time in Spain, in Portugal, about natural law. I'm not going to get into that because it's too much for this, but you can read that in my dissertation. I have an entire chapter about that. And this is an important idea here, because if we say that slaves are irrational and they are the same as animals, that means that that means that they don't have natural rights. And if they don't have natural rights, then those humans that do have natural rights can enslave other humans who are not really human. They're kind of like animals. And so that's what's happening here, this comparison of law. And then here he explains, in the Portuguese language, he explains the entire halachic procedure on the circumcision of a slave. He explains also on the ritual bath. And then he creates his own linguistic categories for 2 types of slaves. He calls one slave that is called servo de Israel, which is that slave that becomes an Israelite through conversion, but by way of slavery. according to the law that we explained in the last class, in the last talk, we talked about Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi says the Jew buys a slave, circumcises the slaves, and has 12 months to convince them to become Jews. And that slave has to do 2 immersions. So he calls that slave Servo de Israel, servant of Israel. But then there's the other slave, which is the one that Rabbi Yitzhak Atiyaz is talking about. He calls it pagan slave, and Rabbi Menashe ben Israel calls him escravo não banhado. So he uses the term escravo não banhado, meaning a slave that's not bathed or not immersed, ritually immersed. So this is a slave that's not going to become a Jew. And this slave is keeps his Canaanite slave status forever, a perpetuum. So something that's interesting about this is when he talks about the laws of Sabbath, the Shabbat, the Torah tells us that you should rest your slaves on the Sabbath. But here, Menashe ben Israel does something interesting. He says that only those slaves which are Servo de Israel, those that have been ritually immersed and circumcised, are subject to this law. So then they can rest. They can rest on the Shabbat. But those pagan slaves, or those slaves that do not want to become Jews, they do not have rest on the Shabbat. They can do all the works that they want to, which are prohibited for Jews to perform on the Shabbat. Now let's talk about the New World communities and slave trading. So here we have various places where Jews went to: Brazil, Barbados, Curaçao, Suriname, Guyana. And in case you don't know where these places are, I have a wonderful map here for you. You can see here in this rectangle these various islands and countries. Jamaica, Dominican Republic, Curaçao is here, which is right above Venezuela. We have Barbados, very small island on this strip of islands here. And in South America, on the mainland, we have French Guiana, we have Brazil, Suriname, and Guyana. So let's talk about Brazil first. Jews in the New World started the slave trading endeavors in Brazil and continued to do so in Amsterdam as either buyers or sellers or investors, as we saw in the contract. While the Dutch Protestant colonialists were guaranteed the right to own slaves by the Estates General in the Netherlands, the Nassau, as an immigrant political community, had to bargain for the privilege to do so. And then after the Treaty of The Hague in 1641, between the Dutch and the Portuguese, many opportunities were bestowed to the Nassau. So this is our political and historical context in Brazil. Now, in 1653, the Portuguese took over the Dutch colony in northeastern Brazil, where Jews had established 2 communities. And they had to leave because the Inquisition was coming for them. And so at that time, history tells us that some Jews, there were 8 ships that left Brazil. One of them stayed in Barbados, another stayed in Jamaica. One got trapped with a pirate and ended up in New Amsterdam, which is today New York. And the others went back to Amsterdam. And not all Jews left. Some that stayed, they decided to hide and live as new Christians. And they continued their lives in Brazil as such. We can find various inquisitorial records in Brazil describing women who are Judaizing. That means that they are practicing Jewish traditions and they were caught by the Inquisition. And they are described being mulata, parda, preta, or escrava, with origins traced back to West Africa. So I want to show you some of these cases. The first case, Mariana de Andrade. She was born in Rio de Janeiro around 1658 to Catarina, her mother. She's described as parda. Parda is interesting because parda is not exactly, is a different shade of brown. It's like a light brown, let's say. She was condemned by the Inquisition of Lisbon as a Judaizer and burnt in public in the Auto da Fe of August 9, 1713. Her mother is described as the escrava, the slave woman, preta, preta referring to her dark skin color, of Simão Rodrigues de Andrade. So Simon Rodrigues of Andrade, that was the father. We have another case here, another Mariana, this is number 2. She lived in Rio de Janeiro in the 1700s. She's described as preta from Angola. She was instructed in the law of Moses by Diogo Bernal da Fonseca and Maria de Andrade and fasted on Yom Kippur. She was denounced by other Judaizers and was sentenced to perpetual incarceration. This is interesting. She was denounced by other Judaizers. That means that those other crypto Jews or new Christians who were caught by the Inquisition, they denounced her in order to save themselves from being tortured. Now we have an interesting case which goes from one jurisdiction to another, from the jurisdiction of Brazil to the jurisdiction of Amsterdam. In 1656, there was a Portuguese Jewish merchant named Eliao Burgos. He left Brazil on one of those ships to Amsterdam with his slave. And he arrives in Amsterdam with Juliana, who's his slave. The notarial records in the archives tell us that Burgos wanted to force her to remain with him in Amsterdam against her desire, then to follow him to Barbados. Now, why did he want to go to Barbados? He wanted to go to Barbados because in Barbados, slaves did not have rights. And anyone who was considered to be black or had dark skin on Barbados was either a slave or was someone who was free. And if they were free, they needed to show or demonstrate freedom papers. Otherwise, they would be enslaved or even just captured by someone else as a slave. There were 2 witnesses from Brazil who came to Amsterdam who declared that they knew Burgos and his black slave, Juliana. Burgos wanted to sell Juliana in Brazil, but after having heard her plea for his compassion, he decided to take her to Amsterdam. Yes, this case is very long, but I'm summarizing. Juliana, when they were in Brazil, she pled to him, please do not leave me here, take me with you. So she was used to her master. She wanted to be with him. But when they arrived to Amsterdam and she had heard that she could be free, because in Amsterdam there was no notion of slavery, then she started to run away from him. And so now Eliao Burgos, he tries to convince her to go to Barbados so that she can continue to serve him. And we'll move on to Suriname. Suriname also in South America. And the context, the political context of Suriname, as we explained, the Jews that left Brazil, some of them went to Suriname. They established a community there in Paramaribo, in the capital city, and in Jordan Savannah, in the Jewish Savannah, as it is known. And at the beginning, they were under Dutch territory, and then the British came in. They were first under English, and then the Dutch came in 1667, and many Sephardi Jews started to go back to Suriname because many had left at the change of power. Some went to Jamaica and established communities in Jamaica. And now, when the Dutch came, many Sephardi Jews from Italy, from Livorno or Leghorn, they went to this colony in Guyana, which is next to Suriname. And at the Treaty of Breda, many Jewish settlers left Suriname for nearby English islands, but returned within a short period. So this is what's happening. There's a lot of movement happening with all these traders because of political changes. And wherever there are political changes, what it means is you cannot trade in the same way. Kind of similar to what's happening now in the United States with these tariffs under the Trump administration. So there's a lot of movement going on. You might not hear about it, but if you follow the economic news, you will see how companies are moving. So this is the same thing that's happening at this time. And our records tells us the following: in 1668, in Suriname, there were 9 plantations consisting of 233 slaves, 55 sugar kettles, 106 head of cattle, and 28 white men. These plantations belonged to Portuguese Jews with the surnames Meza, Pereira, da Costa, da Silva, Cáceres, and de Fonseca, or da Fonseca. So these plantations had those names, which were the names of the owners, who were Portuguese Jews. Here's an interesting case on Suriname, where we find in the notarial records, David Nassi, or David Cohen Nassi. He was born as Cristóvão de Távora, and he had also another name, José Núñez de Fonseca. So he has 3 names here. And this is one of the ways that new Christians were able to move around, maneuver themselves within the new world and hide their Jewish identity. So his Hebrew name is David Nassi. In other documents, David Cohen Nassi. He was a Cohen from the priestly lineage. And but he was born with a Christian name, Cristóvão de Távora. And then he had another name, which he probably did business with, José Núñez de Fonseca. So in this document, the notary, he sent his daughter Sarah and Deborah, who was a mulatta woman. That means she's mixed between a European, in this case Portuguese, and African mother. Deborah was born in his house from Suriname, and now they're going to Amsterdam, then to Cayenne. Cayenne is in Guyana, which is also in South America. His daughter recorded in the notary of Amsterdam that Deborah was born and raised in liberty. That means that Deborah was, if she was born in liberty and raised in liberty, that means that she was not a slave, but her mother was a slave. And she was at some point, probably her mother was freed, and then she married, most likely married David Nassi, and this mulatta woman, Deborah, is his daughter. So he has a daughter with one woman and another daughter with another woman, and these 2 daughters are traveling together to Amsterdam. Why are they traveling together? They're traveling together because Deborah, with her skin color, cannot travel alone, because she will be subject to enslavement if she's caught by anyone without freedom papers. And so she is accompanied by Sarah to Amsterdam. So this is an interesting case as well. This is the entire case. I'm not going to read it, but it's here. I translated this from Dutch. Let's move on to Curaçao. Curaçao, which is 35 miles north of Venezuela. We have very interesting notes about this place for Jews and slavery and slave trade. In 1679, a group of Nassau plantation owners appear in the records of the West Indies Company in Curaçao. We have David Levy and Jacob Núñez da Fonseca and others. There's an Amsterdam-born man named Philip Enriquez, who's also known in his Hebrew name, Jacob Senor. He was the only Jew whom the Holland Board of Admiralty ever granted a concession to purchase slaves from Africa directly and to transfer them to Curaçao on his ship. This is very important because we mentioned about the asientos, which are the contracts to sell slaves from Spain to the New World. But now in the Dutch context, you cannot sell slaves directly, purchase them in Africa and send them directly to the New World without permission of the Dutch. The Dutch had complete control of the trade route. But now there is a Jew who is given the opportunity to purchase slaves from Africa directly and to transfer them to Curaçao on his ship. Now, this is the most ironic thing that I find. The name of the ship is in Dutch, de Vrijheid, which means the freedom. Freedom. So you have a ship named Freedom with slaves. Go figure. Also, on the same island, Curaçao, Jacob Calvo d'Andrade, the director of the Jewish Communal Burial Society in Curaçao, was appointed in 1701 to 1705 as an expert by the West Indies Company to examine the slaves upon their arrival. So when slaves came, there was someone inspecting them, you know, as a medical doctor to say, yeah, this slave is good, this one is bad, take him back or heal him, or we don't want him. And that person was Jacob Calvo d'Andrade. He was a Jew, the director of the Communal Burial Society, the Hebra Kadisha, as we know it in the Jewish community. And one of the things that some historians say about Curaçao and Jews is that it became the entry point for marketing slaves to the Spanish territories of the New World. So now you know what's happening on this little island. This is the place, the new Brazil, so to speak. Brazil was a center of slavery and slave trade in the 17th century, the early 17th century, and part of the 16th century as well. But after the change of power, the trade routes moved to this small island, Curaçao, which is right off the coast of South America, next to Venezuela. And we have a Jew who's in charge of examining the slaves upon their arrival. Now, what do the rabbinic responsa say about slavery? In the Peris Etz Chaim, which is an anthology or a journal of legal responsa, 12 volumes, there are various cases of all things you can imagine, but there are cases dealing with slavery in the colonies. I want to show you one of these cases. So there's a Dutch slave owner who addresses Chacham David ben Rafael Mendola in 1767. So this is what happens. So a Jew, this is Reuben, we don't have his name in order not to in order not to shame them. So there's a Jew who lives on one of the islands and plans to travel to Amsterdam, but does not want to travel with his maidservant, which is a slave, because of the legal prohibitions there regarding holding slaves or trading in slaves. As we said previously, there is no enslavement in Amsterdam, unless she runs away and escapes from him while traveling there. A close friend, Shimon, so this is another name, a generic name, Shimon, who's a friend of Reuben, offers to take care of the maidservant while he is away. So Reuben is going to Amsterdam, and his slave stays with his friend Shimon. 2 years later, the maidservant became pregnant, and her master Reuben hears about this and wants to know about her and the child. Simon returns to the maidservant. He returns the maidservant to Reuben, but keeps the child since he was born under Simon's care. The issue is that Reuben's maidservant became pregnant from Simon's male slave while Reuben was away. Reuben regards the child as an extension of the maidservant and therefore also his property. This is the case that's brought before Chacham David ben Rafael Mendola in 1767. So here's the verdict. The rabbi writes a legal response and says, and we learn that the rabbinic response to this case reflects legal precedents dealing with marriage and slavery, halakha from the Talmud, and the legal conclusions of Maimonides, that's the Rambam. The verdict is that any child born from the maidservant under the care of Simon belongs to Reuben, since the mother is his property. Most importantly, Mendola's ruling complies with the laws of the islands, where the entire trade consisted of slaves and slave labor. So this is what we learned from this case. This is the law. So the rabbinic responsa conforms to the law of the land. We see what's happening in Amsterdam, and we see what's happening in the colonies and the islands. So in the islands, slaves have no human rights. They are considered to be property. And so the rabbi rules according to the law of the land of the island. So now we're entering now to our last section. We go to North America, since we've talked now about the islands and everything. And Chacham Gershon Seixas Mendes, who is a very interesting and important figure in the Spanish-Portuguese history. He is a close friend of President George Washington. And in 1793, he states, "It is not proper for women," referring to the Sephardic women of his community, "to engage in tasks such as nursing or rearing children, cooking, and house cleaning." So this begs the question. I laugh because today, women in the Jewish community, the same traditional Jewish community, are doing these things, for the most part. And if this begs the question, if Jewish women in the community are not nursing, they're not rearing children, they're not cooking, they're not house cleaning, then who's doing all this? Who's doing all this work? And we know are the enslaved women who come from most likely African or sub-Saharan backgrounds. And this is the case in the United States or in the colonies with various Portuguese Jews, not only Portuguese Jews, but also some Ashkenazi Jews who live in the Union, in the Confederate States in the South, and they own plantations and they own many slaves. And so here's an example in the 1800s of a document found in the Lazarus family collection. It contains a letter from Rachel Mordecai Lazarus to a friend in Providence, Rhode Island, on personal and family matters, and a bill of sale for 2 slaves owned by Jacob de la Mota. It's one of my surnames, Mota, Jacob de la Mota, and sold by his executor, Benjamin D. Lazarus. So you can find these kinds of documents in North America, mainly in the South, in the plantations, whether it's in Georgia, in Savannah, also in Charleston, South Carolina, also in Louisiana, specifically in what's the place, New Orleans or Nolans, as they say it there, and in other scattered places throughout. You will find where there are these communities, and they have plantations, they have slaves. And there's a conflict that is going to boil up as we reach the Civil War. That's going to be the topic of our next talk. And there's a book that you can look at for more information called, actually, this is a chapter within the book. The chapter was written by Beltram K. Korn. The chapter is called Jews and Negro Slavery in the Old South, 1789 to 1865. I recommend that you look that up if you want to have many details and information on this matter. And this chapter tells us various things that lead up to the Civil War and problems with adopting the Constitution, slavery and slave trade, involving Jews and Negroes. So this now is the end of our lecture for today, and we will open it up for questions and answers.
Thank you, Yehonatan, very much for that incredible overview of an extraordinary array of sources and geographical areas. We do have some questions here, and again, we'll see what we can get to. First, quickly, could you repeat the names of the books real quick that you did mention? That one just came in.
Yes, The Making of the Atlantic Slavery, and that book is called The Forgotten Jewish Diaspora, and that's written by Peter Mark and Jose Horta Silva. I also mentioned the article by Jews and Negroes in the Old South. So that you can look it up with that title and you'll find it. It's a book chapter.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Let's see. Okay, some more questions are coming in now. Let's see. The first question let's go with is, you talked about, for example, Senegambia, something that's totally unknown and obscure to us today. Are there any, particularly in that region, but maybe in a broader context, are there any communities of descendants of these former slaves, Judeo-Portuguese, communities today?
That's an excellent question, and I know that where I did my master's degree at Florida International University, the semester there was a student who did a master's thesis on this very same topic within the context of Cape Verde Islands. It's the semester after I left. Unfortunately, I was not able to be there at the defense, but and I don't remember the name of the student, but it's something that you can probably look it up. The Cape Verdes and descendants of contemporary Jews. So the contemporary descendants of the Jews of Cape Verde, the Cape Verde Islands. So there is that literature or that research. There's some genetic research that's also has been done in the recent, let's say, the last 5 years or so, of peoples in that region who have Portuguese paternal lineages or Y DNA. So that will correlate with the history that we spoke about today. But in terms of Jewish communities today in that region, we don't have them.
Okay. Okay, great. Another question we have, and this is something I'm sure a lot of people are wondering. I mean, the cases you gave, of course, I think are quite extraordinary. They seem very exceptional. You have some very prominent people who are involved to a much higher degree, but do we have any numbers or statistics on the number of conversos involved or a percentage of the slave trade involved in, say, by Jewish or converso merchants? Is there any numbers?
That's an excellent question. And in the literature, there's two of my colleagues in Amsterdam. One is named Filipa Ribeiro da Silva, and the other is Katia Antunes. They're both Portuguese. And before I utilized their material to do my research when I did the PhD dissertation. And what I came across from their research, they actually quantified how many of these Portuguese Jews were involved in the Dutch slavery and slave trade. So they specifically went through those archives, which were found between West Africa and Netherlands. And what they saw, they came to the conclusion that perhaps 10%, close to 10% of the slave traders then were actually Jews. So that other 90% are Christians, Dutch Christians. So
Okay.
that's in that context. If we talk about the British context, when I did a little bit of research on that, and I found that the Portuguese Jewish community was not really involved in the way that it was in the Dutch context. So you won't really find Portuguese Jews in the UK or in the British Empire doing the same thing. I found that to be very, very interesting. It seemed like they were not interested in slavery and slave trading.
Please.
Let's see, in another context, if we talk about the French context, I can't really talk about that because I haven't done research on that. And then there are other places, if we talk about conversos who are still in Spain and Portugal, who are active within the slave trade, is very, very difficult to quantify because we don't know who's who. And if we knew, they would probably be caught by the Inquisition.
Right, that makes sense. Is there any evidence going to this, say, of the Jews, for example, the converso slaveholders that we do know? Is there any evidence, and I've heard this myself, that Jewish slaveholders treated their slaves any better than non-Jewish counterparts?
Well, that's a difficult question to answer. And the reason why I would say that is because I have found some cases, particularly in Suriname, where slaves are escaping from their slave owners within the Jewish community, the Jewish-owned plantations in Suriname, in Yore Savannah. There are some cases where they're known in history as maroons. They are escaping from their masters, and we have even letters from ex-slaves who are writing about how they were treated. So we cannot issue a blanket statement and say, oh yeah, it was better to be a slave under Jews. Yeah.
Okay. That's of course, I think a fair statement and good to know. Here's another question that I also find particularly interesting. I alluded to it in my opening remarks, but you, of course, went into greater detail. You know, you have the Inquisition, you have the purity blood laws, the Limpieza de Sangre statutes that are targeting conversos, and they're doing what they can to evade, as you said, and having multiple aliases. Do we know, and or maybe this is just your thoughts, I don't know if there's any evidence on this, but is there any connection at all between, say, the development or the widespread application of the purity of blood laws and how they define identity on the basis of, say, blood, basically, right, or the type of a racial descent in the Inquisition and the corresponding, say, rise of slavery and the transatlantic slave trade?
Wow, that's a bomb. So I have that's a question that I need to think about. Really, I haven't thought about that, but I will tell you the following. There was one book that I read in my master's during my master's thesis. This book was in Spanish, written by Jose Medina, who is a historian on conversos in the context of South America. So specifically in Cartagena de las Indias, which is today present day Colombia, Panama, and also he speaks about the context of Peru. And there's one case that I can remember now, many years ago. There's one case of a converso surnamed Rodriguez. He was Portuguese, and he used to slaughter the animals according to the law of Moses. That's what the document states. And Jose Medina makes an assertion about this case and other cases similar to it, where he says that the Inquisition became stronger or more prevalent in those territories because they knew that Jews or Judaizers were in those places and that they were involved in trading. So kind of the Inquisition was a method in order to diminish the economy or the finances of this Jewish nation that is now supposedly doesn't exist, but is now in the New World colonies. And part of that economy is coming from slavery and slave trade. So we could kind of connect, if we build an argument on Jose Medina and what he's saying from the archives, we could kind of build an argument to say that there is a correlation with the Inquisition and slavery in the New World.
Right. You also, you talked again about a number of case studies throughout the Caribbean and of course South America. Is there any information you have about Jews, for example, or say any slavery in Hispaniola as well? Haiti, Dominican Republic, I guess presume where you are. Yes.
Yes, for sure. Yes, the Jews that were in Haiti, some of the slave owners were Jews from Curacao. So we talked a lot about Curacao and how important that was in this part of the world. And what happens with the Haitian Revolution, with Toussaint Louverture, the Jewish owners of slaves, they came over to the right side of the island, so on the Spanish side of the island. And many of the descendants of those Jews who were slave owners on the French side of the island, they became, let's say, the sponsors and the financiers of the Dominican Republic revolution and independence. So that's an interesting thing. That's something that I would like to write about in the near future, how previously they were from slave owners now to financiers of the Dominican revolution. And so we know why that's happening. The Dominican Republic found its independence not from Spain, not from France, but from the Haitians who were previously enslaved. So that's an important note to make.
Wow, that is very fascinating.
Yes.
Some of the other questions we kind of touched on it in the first part, a few weeks ago, but I think it still keeps coming up is, this, I think that feeling of kind of uncomfortableness that we all sit with, it kind of what you even just alluded to about the Haitians enslaving after being enslaved. And
Mhm.
so in the converso and Jewish context, are there any instances, say in the Judeo-Portuguese diaspora, of any converso or Jewish leaders who oppose slavery or try
Oh,
to limit the practice?
thank you so much for that question. And I almost left that out. So I mentioned Rabbi Mendola in 1767 in that case where he replies. So his father, Chacham Rafael Mendola, wrote in a responsa in the same journal of Peri Etz Chaim. And in another case, he says canonized slavery no longer applies. But this is 17 in the 1760s. So I think it's 1765. He makes that assertion, but that doesn't mean necessarily that slave trading is not going to happen anymore. He's making a halachic or legal assertion to say that the community in Amsterdam is no longer applying the notions, the halachic or Talmudic notions of canonized slavery, as we spoke about extensively in our last lecture, in the first part. So
Right.
Jews are still enslaving in other parts of the world that are not the Dutch, that not in the Netherlands. So perhaps his assertion is specifically in the Netherlands, in European context, and not the islands. So that's the only voice. That's the only voice that I have found in that time period where a Portuguese Jew or a Jew is speaking against slavery, the enslavement of sub-Saharan Africans. Now, in the next part of the talk, the third part, there is going to be um, a conflict in the North American context between those rabbis who are in the Union states and those rabbis who are in the Confederate states. There's a clash happening, of course, because it has to do with money and plantation. So we have a clash between human rights, so that's in the Union states, and then a clash having to do with the plantations, so money in the Confederate states in the Old South. So that happens much later. We're talking about 18th, 19th century, mostly 19th century. We're going to see that. But in this context that we covered today, there is now one voice apart from Rabbi Rafael Mendola who says canonized slavery no longer applies. But that really didn't take force.
Wow. Okay. Thank you for that.
Mm-hmm.
How, in general, you've talked about this. One question we have too is your dissertation going to be published as a book?
Yes, it's going to be published as a book. The title is going to be Black Jews and Their Slaves.
Okay, perfect title. And going to that, how would you say in general, say within the broader Sephardic community or the broader Jewish world, how has this part of history been remembered or even silenced, both in, say, Portugal and Amsterdam, and just again in the broader diaspora?
There's a disconnect between the contemporary Nação, the contemporary Portuguese Jews, and this history. Mainly, I would say one, because there's ignorance. Many of the contemporary descendants have forgotten about this history. They don't know about it. If they find out about it, they are ashamed and they don't know how to deal with it.
Right.
I can tell you, in my experience, when I gave 2 lectures at the Portuguese community in Amsterdam on this topic in the library where I did most of my archival research, and for master's students of history, and some of the members, when they saw me there, they asked me, "Hey, what are you doing here? What's going on?" When I would tell them what I was doing, the lecture, the topic, they were like, "Oh, the dark pages of our history." They didn't want to know about it, and they didn't like the fact that I was even touching this topic. And for those of you who don't know, when I chose to embark on this research endeavor, I almost was not going to do it. I presented to one of my doctoral supervisors on various different topics. I gave about 5 different topics. And when he saw this topic, he said, Yehonatan, you need to do this one. And I said, why? He said, because nobody's talking about it, and you're the only one that's going to be able to talk about it. And I said, I realized then that I had something a difficult task before me. I contacted one of my rabbinic mentors back in the States, and he told me, Yehonatan, you have to decide whether you want to be an activist or you want to be an academic. You cannot be both at one time. So I chose to be the academic. So what you have seen here is just a glimpse of the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Indeed, and going to that, and I think this maybe I think this is probably our final question, Yonatan. You know, it is uncomfortable. There is some opposition. There is ignorance, but it's also an important topic, you know, to tackle and to deal with, as you've done so masterfully here today. And so, how can educators and teachers and communal leaders teach this history without fueling anti-Semitic narratives or whitewashing uncomfortable truths?
I love your question, because this question is very relevant to what we are dealing with today. We have the Black Hebrew Israelite community, the BHI in the United States, blaming Jews for the entire slave trade, the entire Slav Atlantic slave trade. We have the Nation of Islam doing the same thing. There was actually a book written in the 1990s dealing with this topic, the secret relationship between Jews and slaves, something like that. And that book has been debunked now because of all the research that came after, namely in the early 2000s. Some of my colleagues did this research in the archives to debunk this. And one of the things that I would say that's very important in teaching this history is to show how it was a collective collaboration between African kings, European traders, European monarchs, the Vatican or the Pope at the time, religious leaders, Islamic or Muslim traders in Africa who had been part of the African, what they call the Arab Berber slave trade for almost 800 years, even before the Portuguese got involved in the 1440s. We have Jews involved, we have Christians, we have Muslims. This is a collaborative effort that's happening. It's not just one group doing everything or masterminding everything. That is false. And also, there are some Africans who are criminals, who are enemies of their respective states or monarchies, who are running away from death. And when they get to the coast in Gambia or these slave castles, they tell the traders, please, senor, sell me for rum, sell me. I will become your slave. Why? Because they knew that as becoming a slave, they will go far away from that context. So they prefer slavery than being killed. And so there are cases like this as well. So all this has, when we talk about the transatlantic slave trade, so the TAST, right? We have to teach it in all of its colors of the rainbow or the electromagnetic spectrum, so to speak. You have to teach it in all of its colors. You cannot just pinpoint one group or one place. We have to try to talk about all of it and in various different contexts. This is a challenge, of course, because it's a lot of history that needs to be uncovered, that needs to be reconstructed, and then needs to be taught in a neutral way, not blaming anyone. That's what I would say. In this way, we can then combat the anti-Semitism or the anti-Jewish sentiments that exist in our times.
Oh, this has been absolutely incredible. and very eye-opening, even for me as well, I'm sure for the attendees.
Oh, I want to add, the reason why I'm naming it Black Jews and their slaves is because many, I mentioned it today, the Euro-African Jews or the lanzados or tangomanos, they are considered to be black according to US standards, but they're white according to the African standards because of their Portuguese connection. So what's happening is, if we have groups today who are, let's say, black supremacists, blaming Jews because they are white, enslaving black people, then if you look at the actual historiography, they're actually black people enslaving other blacks. So that whole argument of blacks or white Jews against blacks falls apart. So that's what I wanted to say.
Indeed. Thank you very much. And I look forward to getting a copy of your book. When it's, I'm sure many people do. Michael, turn it over to you.
Wow. Thank you. Let me make sure that my microphone is on this time. Yes, it is. So first and foremost, thank you, Jonathan, for an amazing, comprehensive, enlightening presentation of such a sensitive yet complex topic with wide-reaching ramifications. It was an amazing job, and I thank you. Before we close, I would like to announce to everyone that part 3 of this series is coming up Sunday, May 11th, also at 1:00 p.m. Eastern Time. And you can register for the event immediately right after this event. We are dropping the link into the Q&A link, but we also will send an email to everyone later this afternoon. As I usually do at some point of our presentation, I would like to make an appeal to everyone. So while some of you do lend support, most seem to overlook the importance of supporting our work, especially the continuation of these free educational amazing webinars. Allow me to state the obvious. While these programs are offered free of charge, they are not free to produce. We spend a lot of time, effort, and money in bringing these programs to you, and we deliver them for free. So I ask you to please get involved, and if at all possible, consider making a tax-deductible donation today. Thank you. Also, before we leave, I'd like to bring to your attention our amazing and very successful educational journeys. These are unique, specially designed tour programs intended to bring the stories of SEFARAD to life. We have an 11-day Morocco tour departing on August 31st and a 10-day Portugal tour departing November 4th. More tours will be announced in the near future, including a tour to Brazil. And with this, we conclude our event. I thank everyone. I thank the panelists, and I thank you, the audience, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.